I never thought the woman I was planning to spend my life with would dismiss my family issues as irrelevant to our relationship. But for months leading up to our wedding, that's exactly what happened every time I tried to discuss the growing tension and drama that was threatening to turn our special day into a complete disaster. What my fiancée Jessica didn't understand was that when you marry someone, you don't just marry them. You marry into their entire family situation, including all the dysfunction, manipulation, and chaos that comes with it, and our wedding. Day became the most painful and expensive lesson in why ignoring family problems doesn't make them disappear. My name is Alex. I'm 29 years old, and this story is about how what should have been the happiest day of my life became a complete nightmare that exposed the true character of both my family and the woman I thought I wanted to marry. I'm sharing this because I think there are probably other people out there who've been caught between toxic family members and partners who refuse to acknowledge that family drama can destroy relationships. And maybe my experience can help someone else avoid the mistakes I made by not standing up for myself sooner. I met Jessica 3 years ago at a marketing conference where we were both presenting on social media strategies for small businesses. She was brilliant, confident, and had this infectious energy that made everyone around her feel motivated and excited about their work. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared ambitions and similar backgrounds as young professionals, trying to build successful careers in competitive fields. She worked for a prestigious marketing firm downtown, while I ran my own digital consulting business that I'd started right after college. Jessica came from what seemed like the perfect family. Parents who were still happily married after 30 years, a younger sister who was finishing medical school, and grandparents who'd been successful business owners and had left a substantial inheritance that had helped fund everyone's education and career goals. Family gatherings at Jessica's house were like something out of a magazine, with home-cooked meals, polite conversation, and genuine affection between all the family members. Everyone supported each other's dreams, celebrated each other's successes, and handled conflicts with mature communication and mutual respect. My family situation was drastically different, and I probably should have been more upfront about that from the beginning of our relationship. My parents had gone through a bitter divorce when I was 16, followed by years of legal battles over money, custody, and property that had created permanent animosity between them. My father had remarried a woman named Brenda who had 2 children from her previous marriage, and the blended family situation had never really worked out despite years of therapy and attempted reconciliation. My mother had never gotten over the divorce and had spent the past 13 years nursing grudges and creating drama whenever possible, especially around holidays or special events when she felt like she wasn't getting enough attention or respect. My older sister Claire had inherited my mother's tendency toward manipulation and victim mentality, always creating crisis situations that required other family members to drop everything and rescue her from whatever mess she'd gotten herself into. My younger brother Jake had responded to all the family chaos by becoming completely unreliable and irresponsible, showing up late to everything when he showed up at all. The dysfunction in my family wasn't just typical family disagreements or personality clashes. It was years of accumulated resentment, boundary violations, emotional manipulation, and deliberate attempts to sabotage each other's happiness. Every family gathering was a minefield of potential conflicts, and every major life event became an opportunity for various family members to air old grievances or create new drama that would dominate everyone's attention for months afterward. When Jessica and I first started dating, I tried to present a sanitized version of my family situation, mentioning that my parents were divorced and that family gatherings could be a little tense, but not going into detail about the extent of the dysfunction or how exhausting and stressful it was to navigate all the competing demands and manipulative behaviors. I was embarrassed about my family's problems and didn't want Jessica to judge me based on their behavior. So I minimized the issues and tried to manage them on my own rather than involving her in the drama. This strategy worked reasonably well. For the first year of our relationship, when we were mostly focused on building our connection with each other and didn't have many occasions where extended family involvement was necessary, But as our relationship got more serious and we started talking about moving in together and eventually getting married, it became harder to keep Jessica separate from the family chaos that was constantly swirling around me. The first major incident happened about 18 months into our relationship when Claire called me sobbing at 11 o'clock on a Friday night because she'd been evicted from her apartment and needed somewhere to stay immediately. This wasn't the first time she'd found herself homeless due to poor financial decisions or conflicts with roommates, and it wouldn't be the last, but she always managed to present these situations as emergencies that required immediate rescue, rather than predictable consequences of her own choices. Jessica and I had been planning a romantic weekend getaway that we'd been looking forward to for weeks, but Claire's crisis meant that I had to cancel our plans so I could help her move her stuff and find temporary housing. When I tried to explain the situation to Jessica, she was frustrated and disappointed about our ruined weekend. But she seemed to understand that family emergencies sometimes required sacrifices and schedule changes. What Jessica didn't understand, and what I failed to explain to her at the time, was that this wasn't really an emergency at all. It was a manufactured crisis designed to test whether I'd prioritize Claire's needs over my own plans and relationships. Claire had known for months that she was behind on rent and facing eviction, but she'd chosen not to address the problem or ask for help until it reached crisis proportions, because she enjoyed the drama and attention that came with having everyone drop everything to rescue her. If you've ever dealt with family members who create constant crises and emergencies to manipulate your time and attention, you probably understand how exhausting and frustrating it can be. And I'd love to hear how others have set boundaries in these situations, because it's one of the hardest family dynamics to navigate successfully. Over the next year, there were several more incidents where my family's dysfunction interfered with our relationship and caused stress or disappointment for Jessica. My mother would call crying about some perceived slight from my father or Brenda, demanding that I take sides in conflicts that had nothing to do with me. Jake would fail to show up for plans we'd made, or would show up drunk or high and create awkward situations that required damage control. My father and Brenda would make passive-aggressive comments about my mother or Claire, trying to recruit me as an ally in their ongoing feuds. Each of these incidents required time, energy, and emotional bandwidth that I would have preferred to spend on my relationship with Jessica or building my business. But I'd been trained from childhood to prioritize family peace and harmony over my own needs and boundaries, so I kept getting pulled into their drama and trying to mediate conflicts that couldn't be resolved because the people involved weren't actually interested in solutions. They were interested in maintaining their victim narratives and continuing their patterns of manipulation and blame. Jessica's initial patience and understanding gradually gave way to frustration and resentment, as she realized how much of our time and energy was being consumed by my family's problems. She'd make comments about how my family seemed to have a crisis every time we had something special planned, or how I always seemed stressed and distracted after dealing with whatever drama was currently unfolding. She suggested that I should set better boundaries with my family members and not let their problems become my problems so frequently. While her advice was probably correct from a mental health perspective, it was also easier said than done for someone who'd grown up in a family system where refusing to participate in the drama was treated as a betrayal of family loyalty. I'd tried setting boundaries in the past, but the consequences were usually even more drama, guilt trips, and manipulation, designed to punish me for not being available whenever someone decided they needed my attention or intervention. The situation reached a turning point when Jessica and I got engaged about 6 months ago. We'd been planning the proposal for weeks, and I'd arranged a beautiful surprise at her favorite restaurant with flowers, champagne, and a ring that I'd spent months selecting. The proposal itself went perfectly, and Jessica was thrilled and emotional and said yes immediately. We were both incredibly happy and excited about taking this next step in our relationship and starting to plan our future together as husband and wife. But within hours of announcing our engagement on social media and calling our families to share the good news, the drama began. My mother immediately started making demands about the wedding plans, insisting that she needed to approve the venue, the guest list, and the seating arrangements to make sure she wouldn't be forced to interact with my father and Brenda in ways that would be uncomfortable for her. She also made it clear that she expected to be consulted on all major decisions and to have a prominent role in the planning process, despite the fact that Jessica and I were paying for the wedding ourselves. Claire jumped into the drama by announcing that she was planning to bring her on-again, off-again boyfriend Marcus to the wedding, even though Marcus had a history of drinking too much and causing scenes at family events. When I suggested that maybe Marcus shouldn't be invited given his track record of inappropriate behavior, Claire accused me of trying to control her life and threatened to boycott the wedding if she couldn't bring her boyfriend. She also started making demands about being in the wedding party and having specific responsibilities that would give her a central role in our special day. My father and Brenda created their own set of complications by insisting that Brenda's children should be included in the wedding ceremony as part of our blended family celebration, despite the fact that I barely knew them and had never had much of a relationship with them. They also wanted guarantees that they wouldn't have to sit near my mother during the ceremony or reception, and they started making suggestions about how we could structure the event to minimize potential conflicts between the various family factions. Jake's contribution to the engagement drama was to immediately ask if he could bring multiple guests to the wedding and whether there would be an open bar, making it clear that his primary concern was having a good party rather than celebrating our marriage. He also started making jokes about giving a best man speech that would include embarrassing stories about my childhood and college years, which worried me because Jake's idea of humor often involved saying inappropriate things that made everyone else uncomfortable. What should have been a joyful time of celebrating our engagement and planning our future together quickly became consumed with managing competing family demands, mediating conflicts, and trying to prevent our wedding from turning into a battleground for old grievances and power struggles. Instead of focusing on what we wanted for our special day, I found myself spending hours on the phone trying to negotiate between different family members and their various requirements and expectations. Jessica's reaction to all this family drama was initially supportive, but as the weeks passed and the demands and conflicts escalated, she became increasingly frustrated with the amount of time and energy we were spending on family management instead of wedding planning. She pointed out that her family had been nothing but supportive and excited about our engagement, offering to help with planning and expenses without creating any drama or making unreasonable demands. The breaking point came about 3 months into our engagement, when we were trying to finalize our guest list and seating arrangements. We'd already had to increase our budget significantly to accommodate all the family members who insisted they needed to be invited, despite the fact that we'd originally wanted a smaller, more intimate celebration. The seating chart had become a complex puzzle designed to keep feuding family members separated while still maintaining some semblance of family unity and celebration. During one particularly stressful planning session where we were trying to figure out how to seat everyone without creating incidents, Jessica finally lost her patience and said the words that should have been a huge red flag about our compatibility and her understanding of what marriage really meant. She told me that she was tired of our wedding planning being dominated by my family's dysfunction, and that I needed to figure out how to manage their problems without involving her, because frankly, my family drama wasn't her problem. She said that once we were married, she expected me to set clear boundaries with my family and not let their issues affect our marriage or our happiness. She suggested that maybe I should consider limiting their involvement in our wedding and our future lives together, because she didn't want to spend the rest of our marriage dealing with the kind of chaos and manipulation that had been consuming our engagement period. On one level, Jessica's frustration was understandable, and her advice about boundaries was probably correct. But her dismissive attitude toward my family situation and her unwillingness to acknowledge that these problems would affect both of us as a married couple was concerning and hurtful. She seemed to think that marriage was just an extension of our dating relationship, where we could pick and choose which aspects of each other's lives we wanted to engage with rather than truly joining our lives together in all their messy complexity. Tried to explain to Jessica that family relationships aren't as simple as just cutting people off or refusing to engage with them, especially when those relationships involve parents and siblings who've been part of your life since childhood. I pointed out that her own family's stability and support had probably made it harder for her to understand why I couldn't just tell my family to behave themselves or exclude them from our lives entirely if they didn't cooperate. But Jessica was, unmoved by my attempts to help her understand the complexity of the situation. She maintained that family drama was optional, and that I was choosing to participate in it rather than being forced into it by circumstances beyond my control. She said that healthy families didn't operate the way mine did, and that I needed to decide whether I wanted to be married to her or continue being enmeshed in toxic family dynamics that would inevitably damage our relationship. This conversation was incredibly hurtful and frustrating because it forced me to choose between defending my family, despite their flaws, and agreeing with Jessica's assessment that they were toxic and should be minimized in our lives. It also revealed a fundamental disconnect between us about what marriage meant and how much partners should support each other through difficult family situations rather than just opting out when things get complicated. Despite these growing concerns about Jessica's attitude toward my family situation, I convinced myself that things would get better once we were actually married and the stress of wedding planning was behind us. I hoped that she'd become more understanding and supportive once she realized that my family's problems weren't going away, and that learning to navigate them together would be an important part of our marriage. I also thought that maybe some of my family members would behave better at the actual wedding, making the situation less stressful for everyone involved. I was completely wrong on both counts, and our wedding day became the most expensive and painful lesson in why you can't ignore fundamental incompatibilities about family relationships and expect them to resolve themselves magically. The warning signs started early on the morning of our wedding. I'd arranged to get ready at a hotel suite with my groomsmen, while Jessica was getting ready at a different location with her bridesmaids. The plan was for both groups to meet at the venue for photos before the ceremony, followed by a reception that we'd spent months planning and thousands of dollars executing. My mother called me at 7 a.m., 3 hours before I was supposed to be at the venue, to inform me that she'd decided she couldn't attend the wedding after all because she'd learned that my father and Brenda would be sitting at a table near hers during the reception. She said that having to see them enjoying themselves at my wedding would be too emotionally traumatic for her, and that she'd rather not come at all than be forced to endure that kind of psychological torture. This was exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that had been happening my entire life, but having it occur on my wedding morning was particularly devastating. My mother knew that threatening to miss the wedding would cause maximum stress and emotional damage, and she was using it as leverage to try to get me to rearrange the entire reception layout to accommodate her comfort preferences over everyone else's. I spent over an hour on the phone trying to convince her to come to the wedding, explaining that we'd already finalized all the arrangements and that changing everything at the last minute would be impossible. I pointed out that this was supposed to be one of the most important days of my life, and that her absence would be heartbreaking for me, regardless of whatever issues she had with my father. But she remained unmoved, insisting that her emotional well-being had to take priority over my wedding day happiness. While I was dealing with my mother's latest crisis, Claire called to inform me that she and Marcus had broken up the night before, and that she was bringing a different guy to the wedding instead. This new boyfriend was someone I'd never met, and Claire couldn't guarantee that he'd behave appropriately or that he wouldn't cause problems during the ceremony or reception. She also mentioned that she was planning to use her maid of honor speech to make some pointed comments about family loyalty and supporting each other through difficult times, which sounded like it was going to be a passive-aggressive attack on other family members. Jake's contribution to the morning chaos was to show up to get ready clearly hungover from his bachelor party activities the night before. Despite my explicit requests that he take it easy and be in good condition for the wedding, he was nauseous, shaky, and barely functional, which meant that instead of enjoying the morning preparations with my groomsmen, I had to focus on getting him sobered up and presentable enough to participate in the ceremony. By the time I arrived at the venue for pre-ceremony photos, I was already exhausted and stressed from dealing with 3 different family crises, and the day was just getting started. Jessica took one look at me and immediately knew something was wrong. But when I tried to explain what had been happening, her reaction was exactly what I should have expected based on our previous conversations about family drama. She told me that she didn't want to hear about whatever problems my family was creating because this was supposed to be our special day, and she wasn't going to let their dysfunction ruin it for her. She said that I needed to figure out how to manage the situation without involving her because she had her own preparations to focus on and couldn't be distracted by drama that had nothing to do with our marriage ceremony. Jessica's response was disappointing but not entirely surprising given her previous attitude toward my family issues. What I didn't anticipate was how much worse the situation would get once the actual ceremony and reception began, and how Jessica's refusal to acknowledge that we were in this together would make everything exponentially more difficult and painful. The ceremony itself was beautiful despite the family drama swirling around it. My mother did ultimately decide to attend, but she spent the entire event making pointed comments to anyone who would listen about how hurt and disrespected she felt by the seating arrangements, and how disappointed she was that her own son's wedding was being used as an opportunity to prioritize other people's comfort over hers. She also made sure to position herself prominently in all the family photos, while simultaneously avoiding any shots that included my father and Brenda. Claire's new boyfriend turned out to be exactly as problematic as I'd feared, showing up inappropriately, dressed and making loud, inappropriate comments during the ceremony that were audible to other guests. During the ring exchange, he actually made a joke about marriage being a trap that caused several people to turn around and glare at him, creating an uncomfortable distraction during what was supposed to be the most meaningful moment of the entire day. Jake managed to stay sober enough to participate in the ceremony, but he was clearly struggling and kept making nervous jokes and comments that revealed how unprepared he was for his responsibilities as my best man. During his speech at the reception, he told several embarrassing stories about my childhood that were inappropriate for the audience and made Jessica visibly uncomfortable, though she tried to hide her reaction behind a forced smile. But the real disaster began during the reception, dinner, when years of accumulated family resentment and dysfunction finally exploded in the most public and humiliating way possible. It started when my mother made a passive-aggressive comment about the seating arrangements within earshot of Brenda, who responded with an equally sarcastic comment about people who couldn't get over ancient history and move on with their lives. What followed was a gradual escalation of insults and accusations between various family members that quickly spiraled out of control, despite my desperate attempts to mediate and de-escalate the situation. My mother started crying loudly about how she'd been mistreated and disrespected, while Brenda called her manipulative and dramatic. Claire jumped into the argument to defend my mother, while simultaneously making accusations about my father's financial obligations that had nothing to do with the current conflict, but added another layer of chaos to the situation. The argument became so loud and disruptive that other wedding guests started staring and murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama that was unfolding during what was supposed to be a celebration of love and commitment. Jessica's family members looked shocked and embarrassed, while her friends seemed confused about what was happening and why no one was doing anything to stop it. I found myself in the impossible position of trying to manage multiple family members, who were all talking over each other, making accusations, and demanding that I take sides in conflicts that predated my marriage by decades. Every attempt I made to calm the situation down or redirect everyone's attention back to the celebration was met with more accusations and demands for validation from different family members who felt like their grievances weren't being heard or addressed. The breaking point came when Marcus, Claire's ex-boyfriend, who had apparently shown up uninvited despite their breakup, appeared at our reception clearly intoxicated and looking for confrontation. He immediately started arguing with Claire's new boyfriend, creating yet another layer of chaos and potential violence that threatened to turn our wedding reception into a complete disaster that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. At this point, Jessica finally realized that her strategy of ignoring my family drama wasn't going to work, because the drama was happening at our wedding reception in front of all our friends and extended family members. She couldn't pretend this wasn't her problem anymore when it was literally disrupting the most important celebration of our lives and embarrassing both of us in front of everyone we cared about. But instead of recognizing that this was a situation we needed to handle together as partners, Jessica's reaction was to blame me for not having prevented the situation from occurring in the first place. She accused me of failing to set appropriate boundaries with my family and allowing their dysfunction to ruin our wedding day. She said that she'd warned me this would happen and that I'd chosen to ignore her advice about limiting my family's involvement in our lives. Jessica's response was particularly hurtful because it came at a moment when I was already overwhelmed and embarrassed by my family's behavior and desperately needed her support and partnership rather than additional criticism and blame. Instead of helping me figure out how to manage the crisis that was unfolding, she was focused on pointing out how right she'd been about my family being problematic and how I'd failed to listen to her warnings. The final straw came when Jessica announced to me in front of several of our guests that she was considering leaving our own wedding reception because she couldn't stand to be associated with the chaos and drama that my family had created. She said that this wasn't what she'd signed up for when she agreed to marry me, and that she was beginning to question whether she wanted to be part of a family where this kind of behavior was considered normal or acceptable. Hearing my new wife threaten to abandon our wedding reception because of my family's behavior was simultaneously the most humiliating and enlightening moment of my entire life. It crystallized everything that had been wrong with our approach to dealing with family issues throughout our engagement, and it made me realize that Jessica had never actually committed to the reality of marriage as a partnership where you support each other through difficult situations rather than bailing out when things get complicated. What happened next changed the trajectory of our relationship permanently and taught me valuable lessons about compatibility, partnership, and what it really means to stand by someone through better or worse. Instead of continuing to apologize for my family's behavior or trying to convince Jessica to stay at our own wedding reception, I finally found my voice and stood up for myself in a way I should have done months earlier. I told Jessica that she was absolutely right. This wasn't what she'd signed up for when she agreed to marry me, because what she'd signed up for was a fantasy version of marriage where she could enjoy all the benefits of being married without dealing with any of the challenges or complications that come with joining your life to someone else's. I pointed out that every family has problems and dysfunction, and that her family's stability was wonderful, but also made her completely unprepared to be a supportive partner to someone who came from a more complicated background. I explained that marriage isn't about finding someone whose family situation is perfect and drama-free. It's about committing to support each other through whatever challenges arise, including family problems that can't be easily solved or eliminated. I told her that her repeated insistence that my family drama wasn't her problem revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what marriage meant and what kind of partnership I was looking for in a life companion. Most importantly, I made it clear that while my family's behavior at our wedding was inappropriate and embarrassing, her threat to abandon our reception and her pattern of refusing to acknowledge that these were our problems to solve together was equally unacceptable, and revealed character flaws that I couldn't ignore anymore. The conversation we had in the middle of our wedding reception, surrounded by confused and uncomfortable guests while my family continued their various dramas in the background, became the beginning of the end of our marriage before it had really even begun. Jessica was shocked by my willingness to defend my position and challenge her assumptions about how our marriage would work, and I was finally seeing clearly how incompatible we were when it came to fundamental questions about family loyalty, partnership, and mutual support. We managed to get through the rest of the reception by essentially agreeing to table our argument until we could discuss it privately, but the damage to our relationship was already done. The wedding night was tense and uncomfortable, with both of us replaying the day's events and trying to process what had happened. Instead of celebrating the beginning of our marriage, we were already questioning whether we'd made a terrible mistake by committing to spend our lives together. The honeymoon, which we'd planned as a romantic getaway to Europe, became an extended argument about family relationships, expectations for marriage, and fundamental compatibility issues that should have been resolved long before we walked down the aisle. Jessica maintained that my family's behavior was unacceptable and that I needed to choose between having a relationship with them and having a successful marriage with her. I argued that her inability to support me through family difficulties and her refusal to acknowledge that marriage meant joining our lives completely, including the messy parts, made her a poor choice for a life partner. By the time we returned from our honeymoon, we were both emotionally exhausted and beginning to acknowledge that our marriage might not survive its first month. The fundamental differences in our approaches to family relationships and mutual support had been exposed in the most dramatic and painful way possible, and neither of us seemed willing or able to compromise enough to make the relationship work. The aftermath of our wedding day disaster forced both of us to confront some hard truths about ourselves and our relationship that we'd been avoiding throughout our engagement. Jessica had to acknowledge that her privileged background and stable family situation had made her naive about the complexities of blended families, divorce, and dysfunction, and that her approach of simply ignoring problems wasn't effective when those problems directly impacted her life. She also had to recognize that her understanding of marriage as a partnership was superficial and conditional, limited to situations where things were easy and comfortable. I had to confront the reality that I'd chosen a partner who wasn't emotionally equipped to handle the kinds of family challenges that were likely to continue throughout our lives, and that her repeated dismissal of my family situation as unimportant had been a clear warning sign that I'd ignored because I was so focused on other aspects of our compatibility. I also had to acknowledge that my own conflict avoidance and people-pleasing tendencies had contributed to the problem by allowing both my family's dysfunction and Jessica's dismissive attitude to continue unchecked for months. The decision to end our marriage came about 6 weeks after our wedding, during a particularly brutal argument about whether we were going to spend Christmas with my family or Jessica's family. Jessica had made it clear that she had no intention of participating in any family gatherings that included my mother, Claire, or Jake, because she considered them too toxic and dramatic to be worth the emotional energy. She suggested that I could visit them on my own if I wanted to maintain those relationships, but that she wouldn't be participating in family events or celebrations that included people she considered problematic. This ultimatum forced me to choose between my wife and my family in a way that felt fundamentally wrong and unsustainable for a long-term marriage. While my family certainly had their flaws and had behaved inappropriately at our wedding, they were still my family, and completely. Cutting them off wasn't something I was willing to do. At the same time, Jessica's inability to find any middle ground or to work with me on managing these relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries made it clear that we weren't compatible for the kind of partnership I wanted in marriage. The divorce process was swift and relatively amicable, partly because we'd only been married for 2 months, and partly because both of us were eager to end a situation that had become untenable for everyone involved. Jessica moved out of our apartment and back in with her parents temporarily while she looked for her own place. And I started the process of rebuilding my life as a single person who'd learned some valuable lessons about compatibility, family, dynamics, and the importance of addressing problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. The financial cost of our failed marriage was substantial. We lost most of our deposits for the honeymoon and other wedding expenses, had to pay for divorce attorney fees, and ended up with a house full of wedding gifts that we had to return or divide between us. But the emotional cost was even higher, including the embarrassment of having to explain to friends and family why our marriage had ended so quickly, and the disappointment of realizing that someone I'd thought I knew well had turned out to be fundamentally incompatible with the kind of life I wanted to build. The aftermath of our wedding disaster and subsequent divorce also forced me to take a hard look at my own family relationships and to start setting better boundaries with the people whose dysfunction had contributed to the destruction of my marriage. I realized that while Jessica's approach of completely ignoring family problems wasn't effective, neither was my pattern of enabling bad behavior by consistently rescuing people from the consequences of their choices and mediating conflicts that they had no interest in resolving. Over the months following my divorce, I started having honest conversations with my family members about their behavior at my wedding and the impact their ongoing drama was having on my relationships and overall happiness. Some of these conversations were productive, leading to genuine changes in behavior and improved communication patterns. Others were less successful, resulting in temporary estrangement from family members who weren't willing to acknowledge their role in creating problems or to make changes that would support healthier family dynamics. My mother, surprisingly, was one of the family members who showed the most growth and insight following our wedding disaster. She eventually acknowledged that her threat to miss the wedding and her behavior during the reception had been manipulative and unfair, and she made genuine efforts to develop better coping strategies for dealing with situations involving my father and Brenda. She also started attending therapy to work on the unresolved issues from her divorce that were continuing to create problems in her relationships with her children. Claire proved to be less receptive to feedback about her patterns of creating drama and crisis situations to get attention and support. She maintained that everyone else in the family was being too sensitive and that she shouldn't have to change her behavior to accommodate other people's comfort levels. This attitude eventually led to a temporary estrangement between us, though we've since rebuilt our relationship with much clearer boundaries and expectations about how we interact with each other. Jake's response to our wedding disaster was to get sober and start taking more responsibility for his actions and their impact on other people. He acknowledged that showing up hungover to my wedding had been selfish and irresponsible, and he made genuine efforts to become a more reliable and supportive family member. His personal growth and commitment to sobriety have actually made him one of the family members I'm closest to now, showing that it's possible for people to change when they're genuinely committed to improvement. My father and Brenda were initially defensive about their role in the wedding drama, but they eventually acknowledged that their ongoing conflicts with my mother had contributed to creating an atmosphere of tension and hostility that had made the situation worse for everyone. They made efforts to be more diplomatic in family situations and to avoid escalating conflicts even when they felt provoked or attacked. The process of addressing these family dynamics and setting better boundaries was difficult and sometimes painful, but it ultimately resulted in healthier relationships and fewer crisis situations that required my constant intervention and mediation. I learned that it's possible to love and maintain relationships with family members who have flaws and problems while still protecting yourself from the worst aspects of their dysfunction. I also learned that any future romantic partner would need to be someone who understood that family relationships are complicated and that marriage sometimes requires supporting each other through difficult situations rather than simply avoiding problems or pretending they don't exist. The experience with Jessica taught me that compatibility around family issues is just as important as compatibility around career goals, financial values, or lifestyle preferences. About 18 months after my divorce, I started dating again. And I was much more upfront about my family situation and the kinds of challenges that any long-term partner might face. I made it clear from early in relationships that I was looking for someone who could be a true partner through both good times and difficult ones, and that I wasn't interested in anyone who saw marriage as an opportunity to cherry-pick the easy, parts of my life while avoiding the complications. This approach led to some shorter relationships with women who decided they weren't interested in dealing with the complexities of my family situation, but it also eventually led me to meet someone who had experience with her own challenging family dynamics and who understood that marriage meant committing to support each other through whatever arose, including problems that couldn't be easily solved or eliminated. My current girlfriend, Amanda, comes from a family that has dealt with addiction, mental illness, and financial struggles, so she understands the reality of loving people who sometimes make poor choices or create difficult situations. When I told her about my wedding disaster and the lessons I'd learned about family relationships and partnership, she was empathetic and supportive rather than judgmental or dismissive. She's also shown genuine interest in getting to know my family members and finding ways to participate in family relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The contrast between Amanda's approach to family challenges and Jessica's approach has been incredibly revealing and healing. Amanda asks questions about my family members' backgrounds and motivations, offers suggestions for managing difficult situations, and has been willing to attend family gatherings where she's provided moral support and helped defuse potential conflicts through her calm presence and diplomatic communication style. Most importantly, Amanda has never made me feel like my family's problems are burdens I have to carry alone or issues that are irrelevant to our relationship. She understands that when you marry someone, you're signing up for their whole life, including the messy and complicated parts, and that successful partnerships require both people to be committed to working through challenges together rather than abandoning each other when things get difficult. The experience of my failed marriage and the lessons I learned about family dynamics, compatibility, and partnership have ultimately made me a better partner and a stronger person. I'm more aware of red flags in relationships, more willing to address problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves, and more committed to finding someone who shares my values about mutual support and commitment through both good times and challenging ones. My family relationships are also healthier now than they've been in years, partly because I've set better boundaries and expectations, and partly because the wedding disaster served as a wake-up call for several family members who realized that their behavior was creating real consequences for the people they cared about. While we still have our challenges and occasional conflicts, we've developed better communication patterns and more respect for each other's boundaries and relationships. Looking back on my wedding day disaster, I can see that it was actually a blessing in disguise that revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Jessica and me before we wasted years trying to make an unworkable relationship succeed. The pain and embarrassment of that day taught me valuable lessons about the importance of choosing partners who are genuinely committed to supporting each other through life's complexities rather than people who want all the benefits of marriage without any of the challenges. The statement that proved Jessica wrong wasn't anything dramatic or vindictive. It was simply the realization that family drama becomes your problem when you marry someone, whether you acknowledge it or not, and that pretending otherwise doesn't make it disappear. Marriage is about joining your life completely with someone else's, including their family relationships, their emotional baggage, and their ongoing challenges that can't be solved with good intentions or wishful thinking. Jessica learned this lesson the hard way when our wedding reception became dominated by exactly the kind of family drama she'd insisted wasn't her problem, and when her strategy of ignoring the situation proved completely ineffective in protecting her from its impact. The chaos and embarrassment she experienced that day could have been minimized if she'd been willing to work with me on managing my family relationships proactively rather than dismissing them as irrelevant to our marriage. The experience also taught me that it's better to be alone than to be with someone who sees partnership as conditional and limited to situations where everything is easy and comfortable. True partnership requires commitment to supporting each other through difficulties, not just celebrating together during good times. And any relationship that can't survive family challenges probably isn't strong enough to last through the other. inevitable difficulties that arise over the course of a lifetime together. If you've made it through this long story, I hope it serves as a reminder that family relationships and dynamics are important factors to consider when choosing a life partner, and that dismissing or minimizing these issues rarely makes them go away. Marriage is about much more than just loving someone. It's about committing to build a life together that includes all the messy, complicated realities of being human and finding someone who's genuinely prepared for that level of partnership and mutual support. The wedding day that was supposed to be the beginning of our happily ever after instead became the end of a relationship that was never built on a strong enough foundation to weather real challenges. But it also became the beginning of my journey toward finding a partner who truly understood what marriage meant and who was prepared to be by my side through whatever family drama, personal struggles, or life challenges might come our way. Sometimes, the worst experiences lead to the most valuable lessons, and sometimes what feels like failure at the time is actually the first step toward finding what you were really looking for all along.